Bienvenidos, bienvenidas to the launching of the ReVista on monuments and counter monuments. For the last hour or so, we have been in private discussions, which we will be sharing with you about the different sections of ReVista and monuments and counter monuments. But before we get to the results of those discussions, I would like to say a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, this session is being recorded. It will be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And we'll let you know about that so you can share with friends and relatives and colleagues. The second thing, we will, after the presentations, we will really welcome your questions and your comments. You may put them on at any time that you feel like during the session. You don't have to wait until the end. The chat is disabled. Use the thing that says Q&A. So now, after those housekeeping things, I would have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, who doesn't need introduction to most of you, Deanna Sorensen. She's the James E. Rothenberg Professor of Romance, Languages, and Literatures and of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. Welcome, Deanna.
Thank you, June, and welcome to everybody gathered here to discuss what I think is a splendid issue of ReVista. I will be brief. I think there's a certain irony to the fact that, as Jeffrey Schnapp reminds us, Musil said that documents are condemned to invisibility. They repel attention, Musil says. But in recent decades, they've become the focus of attention of political movements that have been, shall we say, iconoclastic. And the essays gathered in this collection give us alternatives to the static nature of monuments. They unfreeze them and they shift monumentality away from a static quality. And I just want to say some of the things they actually do to accomplish that unfreezing of the monuments. Sometimes the actions involve demolishing. I loved the phrase tumba estatuas that comes up in an essay by Tomás. Sometimes they deface. Sometimes, though, they reappropriate and transform a monument. And that is discussed in essays about Bolzano in Italy or the case of the Statue of Liberty in Colombia. Sometimes they are cloaked. I think of Cristo, but I love to read about the work of Minaya in Mora Beauchamp-Byrd's essay. I thought that was extraordinarily powerful as a practice. Another action that I think is extraordinarily productive in this counter monumentality is the sheer effort of making. And to me, the most powerful example is discussed by Andreas Huyssen in the essay about Doris Salcedo. Just the thought of the conversations that had to take place to get those K-47s, but also the sheer work of banging away the steel in order to create a floor that you step on. So that sort of making is one way to unfreeze a document. And then the essays comment on many cultural and material practices. And here it's less about the matter of the monument and more about the practice. These could be storytelling. It could be turning in a memorial into a collective work where people actually collect, negotiate, and they create perhaps paths and itineraries from memory, as Monica Schmurgut's article discusses in Lomas de Zamora in Buenos Aires. Sometimes it's a question of gathering evocative objects in what might be ephemeral tributes to COVID deaths, to slavery, to the disappeared, or to the deaths that followed the pandemic. So these practices move us away from monuments as eliciting a passive, very often submissive practice of contemplation, and they produce a completely different type of civic engagement. And that civic engagement might lead to interrogating the meaning of the word victim, something that was discussed cogently in the article on El Ojo que Llora in Peru. It might involve doing revisionary research into the rhetoric of memorializing a certain event. I'm thinking here of the essay on the Alamo in Texas. It could be studying the models and the persons used to create some of these monuments. Here, I think of Matilda Filgelovich's study of Luz Jimenez and her agency during the Mexican Revolution and the artistic practice that ensued. Or it could be the ghost monument with the photographs of the dead Inca noodles. So I found the productivity of this issue precisely in moving us away from just the monumentality question and into these forms of action and practice that may be a form of memorializing, or it may be a tribute, paying homage to a person or a group. One last thing that I heard in one of the sessions that I think should lead to very productive conversations is the question of gender. We all know that the great majority of monuments evoke men, white men on horseback. And how do we move away from that? Many of the essays give us very interesting alternatives to that. So with that, I will stop and ask the various group leaders to present what their conversations yielded. Thank you. I think, June, I'll pass it over to you.
So our first presenter will be Paolo Vignolo of the National University in Bogota, who led the group on counter monuments.
Thank you very much, June. Saludo a todas y todos. Difficult task indeed to make a synthesis of such a fruitful discussion, but I'll make my best. We focused on the three questions that arise from this ongoing wave of attacks of what I like to call the statu quo throughout the Americas and worldwide. The first one is, okay, if the demolition and the turning down of statues can be seen as a starting point, but not the end of the story, what alternative strategies to demolition, razing, turning down do counter monuments offer? So here we find a very wide range of opportunities and possibilities. Emily Godbey, with her work on ofrendas and ofrendas during the COVID crisis, as during situations where funerals and mourning rites are difficult to maintain, stresses the ephemeral and personal memorials as a very effective way to work on grief and work on trauma. At the same time, Mora Beauchamp, analyzing the Jory Minaya's cloaking of the statue of Columbus in Ponce de Leon in Florida, stresses on cloaking, on redressing and cleansing, and making clear that in these dialogues and this kind of intervention is truth-telling in historical memories is at stake. And in what sense? In sense of fashion, gender identities, of showing the masquerade and the carnivalesque, and as well in a very subtle, very a way that concerns more the material and the practices, as Diana was saying, the indigenous resistance that is maybe just comes out just with the kind of fabric that evokes tropical plants like Sarangueyo, Mansilla de la Muerte, were very important in the resistance, indigenous resistance and cleansing and purification. At the same time, the Andreas Huyssen makes very clear that in Fragmentos, the work that Doris Salcedo, together with the architect Carlos Granada, created in Bogota, there is an aesthetical opposition to traditional forms of the monumental. And in this case, the counter-monumental is not considered to be ephemeral, but is the option to literally create a floor out of the melted weapons of the former guerrilla, FARC guerrilla, to create a space of debate and of mourning and of remembrance. Other interventions in the issue talk about the transfer, for example, what it means to make a cemetery with Confederate statues. Transfer as a very powerful political act as well. Recontextualization, mockery, carnivalesque, festive performances as another way to replace or rethink this traditional patriarchal colonialist kind of monuments, and an emphasis, and here we come to the second point, to the genesis in historical time of counter monuments. Counter monuments allow to show the genesis, the self-production, and the production of the memorializing process. And here we come to the second question that deals with temporality and spatiality. How counter monuments engage memory work in terms of temporality, the ephemeral, the durable, the eternal, and spatiality. They play with invisibility, with the private public borders, with invisibility and media exposure. Here in the debate, it was very clear that counter monuments have to do a lot with metamorphosis, with the memento mori, for example, in food and flowers and candles, when we talk about offers, ofrendas, but also with the contrast between the ruins of an old colonial building and the floor of melted weapons we were talking about in Doris Salcedo's work. The question that Jeffrey Schnapp was the paradox made to remind us to the possibility of eternity, but that inevitably go to oblivion. So how is this fading out, dying out works? And the third question, just to conclude, how should counter monuments practices be grounded in participatory and collective decision-making processes? That's a tricky question that has to do with the stakeholders, has to do with money as well, as we pointed out in the discussion, and probably has a very different answers, but we all agreed that the cooperation in some point and public discussion at some point is crucial for counter monuments. Sometimes the decision-making process goes along with the building and creation of counter monuments, sometimes not, but we do consider that counter monuments have their peak moment in the public arena, in the public discussion, and somehow, as James Young points out, we're talking about a shift between from collective memory as the nation iconic way to think about memorials to a collected memory, where from a very heterogeneous kind of remembrances, we can find a common understanding that puts together these widely disparate experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. Gracias. Our next presenter will be group leader Tomás Straka, who's from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. Tomás?
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity. I will talk about the focus of Venezuela and the results of our discussion about among the different writers of this focus. One of the focus of present issue of the ReVista is about Venezuela. This situation was represent a small surprise for me, and even for the other authors of this focus, because why amid the global context of the counter monument, of the protest, riots, manifestation, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter, and the many tear down of many monuments around throughout the world, why Venezuela could be a focus to answer this question. We have to reflect and discuss about the situation, and we reached to three possible hypotheses about the importance of the Venezuelan case in the global context of the counter monument movement around the world. Venezuela is a specific and very illustrative case of the policies of memory deep in all this situation, in all these discussions, polemics, manifestation, is present this phenomenon of the policies of memory, or in German, Vergangenheit politics, the policy of the history, the policy of the history, the policy of the memory. Three issues, three aspects makes Venezuela a particular case, and particular or so particular interested case of this phenomenon, this situation. The first one, the context of the Bolivarian Revolution. Probably Venezuelan start before, and very also before, to this wave of counter monuments, because the Bolivarian Revolution, or the Chavismo Revolution, the revolution that have led Hugo Chavez, prompt the discussion of a big discussion of the past, a big discussion of the history, and rapidly this discussion produced a new toponymia, produce a new monument, produce or try to produce a new symbols in Venezuela, and a big discussion in this around these proposals and these policies. The tumba statuas, probably the first statues of Christopher Columbus that teared down in Latin America in this wave was in Venezuela in 2004, 16 years ago. That is a landscape, an important landscape in this context. Many this is another characteristic. Many of the assessment, many of the mottos, of the causes of the counter monuments around the world in Venezuela was prompt with the states, with the revolutionary states. And in this context, the situation is different, because many of these proposals, of these assessments, of these postures on front the monuments are officially are of the official of the states, of the system, and the counter system probably in Venezuela is to respect Colón, for instance. It is a different situation, and a particular characteristic to understand the big problem, the big phenomenon of the policy of the memory. This is one characteristic, the first characteristic of Venezuela. Start before this wave. The second characteristic is the forgetfulness. It's paradoxical, but in all the problems of the policy of the memory, the tension, the dialectic is between the memory or memorization and the forget. This is a problem. And in the policy of the memories, they use the manipulation of the memory. One of this proposal, of this objective of the course is put in the minds of the society some idea, and the other objective is to forget in the mind of the society some other ideas. The problem of the forgetfulness produced in Venezuela is very interesting, because the society is not really aware about the all its history. In our focus in Venezuela is you can read an important article about one monument, about our oil history, and this is very interesting how a landscape and very important facts of our history, the blow up of the Barroso. This is the blow up Breventon it's the naming in Venezuela, of the Barroso, an important landscape hito of our history, in the place where this blow up of oil blow up occur. It's complete forget even the specific place. This is a paradoxical and shows the dialectic between the memory and forgetfulness. The third thing is in this context of the specifically Venezuelan case, the specific Venezuelan case is particularly Venezuela case is the produce new types of monuments, new ways to erect new monuments, new object to public object to build and determine memory. It's the case in the case of the article of about the article. It's the case the article of of Yaneira Wilson is the case the inhabited monument transform social buildings of social interest enacted by the state in a monument of Chavez with the age of Chavez, a big age, a giant age of Chavez painted in this work. This is a particular case, very interesting as a sort of big brother that watch the society every time. Well, in conclusion, Venezuela is interesting and important case of study to understand the wave of or the longer problem of the policy of memories. That is the problem, but the theoretical problem of this wave of counter monument. Venezuela started before this wave, a decade before, and Venezuela produced in this process many specific and particularly aspect and phenomenon to understand this problem. Well, more or less, it was that we talk each other during our meeting, private meeting. I have to apologize for my English. My proficiency is not the better. I hope the ideas could be more or less clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomás. Gracias. Our next group is focus on Afro-descendants. The discussion leader is Maria Mercedes Martinez from the British Museum in London, and she will be accompanied by Sharon Perez, who was a visiting artist at the museum. Welcome, Maria Mercedes.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Just a note that the group was passed over to us because our group leader felt that it would be better represented by women and by a Black woman, not me, Sharon. And another note, just to say that Sharon's project is in the future, so it actually starts in January, but we've already been having preliminary discussions. So just to summarize a bit of what we talked about and discussed in the group, which I think was a bit smaller than everybody else's. We talked about the main theme of invisibility, and so how monuments dedicated to Afro-descendants in some places like Bolivia, Sharon put, don't exist, and in other places like Roberto Condoru mentioned, there is, but the proportion is so much less in Brazil than there is of other types of monuments. And so I think that was the key takeaway for us from that discussion. And so I'm gonna pass it on to Sharon quickly so she can talk a bit more about this.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm gonna try to speak in English. I hope you can understand. Great. when we are talking about the monuments, in that case, we need to know that we make the carnival as a monument. We make different expressions with our body, with our clothes, and we try to transmit our culture. But it's so difficult because when we start to make that, we are trying to use some specific traditional things. And cuando pasan los años, cuando pasan los años, we are changing this kind of things. And maybe the carnival is not the same as, it's difficult. I'm trying to do. Lo que quiero decir es que no es, el carnaval va cambiando nuestras tradiciones, nuestra cultura, y no necesariamente nos representa como quisiéramos. En cuanto a los monumentos que son físicos, for example, the sculptures, we don't see ourselves in that monument. We need to make more representatives in painting, as the work that I do in the last 9 years. We are trying to use the Afro-Bolivian descendant people in portraits because we need to feel representative in that places. And when we see the monuments as Cristobal Colón or many other monuments, we didn't see ourselves. In Bolivia, we don't have any monuments that we can feel representative in Afro-descendant cultures. We don't think the governments are changing these things. And it's difficult because in the next generation, we need to see in some specific places. As in the article, we are talking about that because we need to change this kind of things. And maybe we are doing this as other practice of artists. Maybe the dancing, the saya, for example, is a typical dancing of Afro-descendant peoples. And we are changing this dancing for make of game, para ganar espacios en monumentos, espacios en museos o en espacios donde antes no se nos visibilizaba, ¿no? O sea, we are using the dancing for change or visibilization for other people. I don't know if you understand my ideas.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sharon. And just to build upon what Sharon just said and what we discussed in the group, not only is there an invisibility in monuments, but the same happens in museum collections. And so not only at the British Museum where me and Laura Osorio work, but also Catherine Zampek has a project in El Salvador, which she was writing about, which also touches upon this, where collections exist of Afro-descendants but aren't named. And so, for example, at the British Museum, we have collections relating to these dances that have not only reference, but also belong to communities in Bolivia and Afro-descendant communities in Bolivia, but aren't written as such and aren't recognized that way. So it's also a task of, I guess, naming what things are and giving the proper space. Other themes that we touch upon was answering the question of should monuments be torn down? And there was a bit of disagreement in the group of how to approach this because, yes, I think from an academic point of view, discussions before monuments turn down is something that we can all say is reasonable to discuss why and to not erase that history. But I think if it comes from a personal point of view of that monument not representing you and actually representing something quite horrible for you personally, it feels less important to have a discussion and more immediate. But there's definitely a lot more to say about that. And then Emma Roberts's paper about Jamaica and Barbados brought up a very interesting point about reception of monuments and about the context. So she was discussing a monument of Rodney in Jamaica that had been moved from the ancient, from the old capital to Kingston, and the reception of that, and how over time the meaning of these monuments changed. And I think that happens in a lot of places. And also, we were discussing what should monuments be in the future, and so who should make these monuments, and who should they be for. And so I think those were the key themes that need to be discussed when erecting new monuments and new counter monuments, to not fall into the same cycles. And yeah, I think that was about it. If anybody from the group wants to add anything.
Thank you very much. Gracias, Mercedes y Sharon. You talked about the group being small. We actually had a smaller group, which would have been a very diverse group. It had everything from a look at gay monuments to monuments in the pandemic, artists. And so I'm going to ask if Catherine Sempik of Illinois State University would very briefly like to report on the discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, June, and thanks for inviting me and for putting together this great event. And I had the treat of a private conversation with Marjorie Agosin, and I want to return our conversation centered on something that Diana referred to towards the end of her introduction to this forum, and it's gender, and that the presence and recognition of gender and its importance to this. And I think the title of this section, In Search of Identity, I wondered why it wasn't Finding Identity, but I think In Search of shows that it's this ongoing process and evolution that's always happening. We're always seeking, and that's a thread that I think runs through many of the essays in this issue. But in thinking about gender and gender and power, and who's making the decisions about creating the monuments, and how their identity informs the final production of. And in Marjorie's case, she's looking at Violeta Parra, who she knows in reality to have been this petite, intimate person dedicated to social justice and songs of longing. And yet the monuments of her are these giant, kind of unapproachable stone, sort of cold. And in this, Marjorie we were really talking about how the materiality of the monument speaks in a way, and she found this speaking in a way that was dissonant with who Violeta was. And so that Violeta was lost in that monument process. And part of that, and this is a theme that's come through in some of the other presentations, is that it's forgetting part of who Violeta was. So women are consistently forgotten in monuments. They're not represented in any sort of equitable way. And even worse is that women artists are not constructing. So there's not a diversity of genders that are being represented, and a diversity of genders who are producing these works necessarily of the canonical kinds of monuments. And she talked about, because in her essay, some of the museum was burned down twice, the Violeta Parra Museum, and one of the sculptures of Violeta was partly destroyed. And I said, I asked, what's going on? And she said, I think people don't connect to it. They don't see themselves in this monument. They don't connect to the monument. And what they see is the impossibility of change, and that and then they're resorting to violence as a way to try to enact some sort of change. So there's engagement, but not the sorts of connections that relate fundamentally to the person that it's supposed to be representing. So across the essays, again, I agree with June. I'm really sorry that the other authors couldn't be here, because it's a really wonderful group that touches on all these themes that really enhance our perspectives. Because on the one hand, even though Violeta was diminished in some ways, what was represented of her was less than the person who she was. The essay by Matilda is really good at showing, despite representations of multiple artists of this amazing woman, she's able to have her voice and have her presence, even though it's she becomes part of canonical works. So I think this the bottom line is the search for identity is ongoing, and it's really beautifully represented in many of the essays in this collection. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next group has to deal with places of memory, and Lucas Merteikian, who is a doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate Romance Languages and Literatures Department, is the group leader.
Thank you. Thank you, June. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thanks, everyone. I had the pleasure of leading the section about places of memory. We had many essays dealing with different sites of memories in different countries in Latin America, and also in Texas, in El Alamo. Some of the things we talked about in many ways resemble the discussions that other groups had, and also the remarks that Diana made at the beginning of this conversation. We talked a lot about gender as well, not only about how sites of memory should acknowledge questions of gender and gender violence, but also about how gender discussions in general are reshaping in very challenging ways our discussions of memory in general, and specifically discussions on victims and perpetrators. So that was one of the main takes from our discussions. Again, about the topic of victims, this also came up in terms of who should be considered a victim, and which kind of victims are memorialized in monuments such as El Ojo que Llora in Peru, which commemorates the victims of the armed conflict in Peru throughout the past 2 decades. This also led to discussions on sites of memories and time. We all agreed on the fact that sites of memory have a life of their own. So even if they are conceived of as eternal or everlasting, it is often the case that this is challenged by the very same communities that have to live in the same space as these monuments or sites of memory. This, of course, has recently taken many forms, as Diana was saying: defacement, demolishing, reappropriation, and we discussed that at length. I also wanted to mention that we talked about the question of space, because many of the essays in this section of ReVista actually deal not only with monuments, but also with space. It was noted that space is always socially constructed and socially lived. And one of the main takes from our group was that as Rafael Cardoso proposed, since space is socially constructed and socially lived, it doesn't matter how it was originally conceived of, how it was originally planned to be lived, but communities can and should reappropriate those spaces. We discuss ways in which this could be done. For instance, how could monuments that are being challenged by different communities today could be approached, even in physical terms. For instance, whether you can walk to a monument, however big it is, the ways in which you can physically relate to it. This has also been the case with the monument to the victims of the armed conflict in Peru. Margarita noticed in her essay, the ways in which people relate to these places have changed. And also in the case of these spaces, they are sometimes both sites of painful and violent memories, but also of memories of happiness, even joy, I'd say. This was very telling in Monica Surmuk's essay about intimate places of memories, both public and private places of memory in Argentina related to the last military dictatorship. I also wanted to say that in our group we were lucky enough to have Antonio Martorell's talk about his own practice as an artist. He was one of the designers of the monument that memorializes the victims of the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, now in Battery Park, New York. And this was also an example of how communities, in this case, the Puerto Rican diaspora, can reappropriate places, in this case, in New York, to somehow battle against time and against, in this case, official narratives. In this case, the Puerto Rico's government official narrative of how many victims there were due to Hurricane Maria. And this finally, just wanted to comment on the fact that this discussion on monuments is, as many said, Tomás also mentioned this in the case of Venezuela, it's also happening very much here in the US and also in relation to Latin America. And I think that kind of transnational dialogue can be seen in Catherine's essay about El Alamo. And I think it's also a good opportunity, and this meeting is a very good opportunity to remind us that memory is often transnational, often involves communities that borders, national borders, do not contain, do not officially contain. And so it's important to try to bring those national and regional, transnational identities together in our discussions of how we should conceive of new monuments and what we should do about monuments that are already there, even if we do decide to keep them and to reflect on them. So that's pretty much it. If nobody else in the group has anything to add. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Gracias, Lucas. I'm going to thank you all for your presentations. They were great. And you all kept to your time, which is almost unheard of in a meeting. So I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Deanna Sorensen, for the question and answer period. We will end at 2:15.
Just to make sure the process is correct, I will identify the questions as they come up. And there's one here that I will read. It comes from Patricia Marchevka. She says that there's a trend in Paraguay to eliminate all traces from one former president. Even though there are important public infrastructure projects, hydroelectric, hospital, etc., that can't be denied. What is the approach to confront history from collective memory erasing? So I see that Paolo is trying to answer. I would like our panelists, anybody interested in addressing this question? In some ways, our discussion today answered the question by referring to all the collective practices of memorializing that would lead to dealing with this question. But I'd like to see if anyone would like to take up this question about Paraguay that I just read.
I think Paolo wants to say something.
Please go ahead.
But I would ask to people in my group to help me out, because it was actually part of the discussion. We talked about the expanded counter monuments. And here Patricia is raising the question of expanded monuments and memorials. I mean, an hydroelectric infrastructure can be somehow a memorial. I'm thinking about the stadium in Rome, which is a big memorial to Mussolini and fascism, and hasn't been erased, is there, with all the symbols. So we were talking about the fact that demolition, that blowing monuments up, do not erase them. And so there is a striking dissonance. That's why we were very skeptical about the demolition as a way to face these controversial memories, and we are much more keen in the group to think about transformation, resignification, masquerade, refunctioning. But please, if Andreas, Emily, and Mora can help you out.
One of the discussions that we were having were, thinking about those alternatives that could happen. And I discussed how, looking at the work of artists like Joy Rimanaya and thinking about what they bring, the kind of insight that they bring to thinking about challenging or troubling historical narratives. And I said that all of this is part of the afterlives of, of these monuments. And that's important to document. For me, coming from a museum background, what was interesting is what happens after a work like the Columbus that's in Miami is erected in 1952. What happens 10 years later, 50 years later? And it's exciting for me to look at the work of an artist like Joy Rimanaya and this idea of a kind of temporary cloaking, of the work that ends up engaging with all of these layers. And that's what these contemporary artists are bringing, this engagement that is conceptual, that is also dealing with the pictorial. And for me, it was the layered quality of the work. She has this cloak on this figure that was erected in 1952, a very masculinist, image of this figure that seems to combine the look of a saint. I mentioned in the article a kind of Superman thing that happens. Also, the gesture. I wanted to really pick apart, how that monument was, the kinds of ways that meaning was being made, and how the artist, how Joyri's work forces us to look at gesture, forces us to look at all kinds of histories in terms of that colonial history. And she has this cloaking that goes on there that is a decorative one, but it's deceptively decorative. And that's what I talk about in my article. This way of, looking at these histories that are seen as challenging. And what artists do is they provide us with new ways of examining all of these works. And it's important to document that as well. We also talked about time and how over time, there's a shift that happens in the perception of these monuments too. When there's a point at which they're erected, and then there's the points where there's a pushback that comes in. And so we all, in my group, we talked about the importance of documenting all of those moments, that come up. So.
Thank you.
I don't have that much to add because I don't know the case of Paraguay, but it sounded to me like it was an attempt to control the archive. But archives, state archives, have always, suffered from control. So there have to be counter archives that have to be created in order to maintain memory. And I like Paolo's notion that, the built environment itself is an archive of, of political figures, and that can't be denied. The thing that came to my mind is the practice of the Soviets to control photography, just wiping out certain figures who were clearly, in the photograph at an earlier time and who get wiped out. Possibility for that has multiplied by many dimensions in the digital world, of course, but ultimately, these attempts to wiping out history are in the long run not very successful. I mean, that's my hopeful note in this case.
Andreas, while you're still taking the floor, so to speak, I wonder if you would mention something you said during the smaller session about instances when it might make sense to destroy a monument.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I shared
had a dystopian vision for 2024.
Right. I mean, I basically shared our group's notion that destroying and demolition is not the right strategy because it's just another instance of destroying history. What comes to my mind in that context is Henry Ford's infamous saying, history is bunk. Now, I was imagining the return of monuments, like the return of Stalin monuments in the former Soviet Union, or of Frederick the Great, for instance, even in the East German, whose monument was put back up by the East German government shortly before 1989. Maybe that was one of the reasons why 89 happened. But I began to imagine, I mean, we see the rise of neo-fascism, of a fascism of the 21st century in the United States today. What about Robert E. Lee, if that monument in Charlottesville is not destroyed? One could imagine, and I don't want to imagine it, but one could imagine its reappearance in Charlottesville under a second presidency of Donald Trump after 2024. And in that case, I would say, let's destroy it.
I think many of us would be there as tumba estatuas, I mean, toppling with you. Thank you. Let me just point to some additional comments that appear in the question and answer section. Maung points out that monuments are not just historical narratives, but they represent our present day values. who we glorify and what we glorify tells the world what we value. I wonder if panelists can speak about the collective value.
Hi, I just wanted to echo a little bit of what Mong said and to respectfully push back, Andreas, about, I think there is a distinction about what gets monumentalized, and that to me, no monuments are sacred anymore, because I've just become too aware of everything that else that is not monumentalized, and all kinds of histories, all kinds of communities, all kinds of people who have not been monumentalized. And that's where the politics, to me, of elevating has just been so clear, and something that I, as a white person, just never thought too much about until the last several years, right? About who is elevated, who isn't elevated. And so for me, it really has, and yes, we're seeing a violent, we talked about this in our group, certainly in the United States and in my home state of Texas, which I even hesitate to say right now. You know, you see a violent reaction to Black Lives Matter, to movements, you know, to this fear of history, of truth, right? And what is that about? It's so fascinating to see this concern, this worry about taking on white supremacy, you know, of everything that Americans at least have learned is the good that comes through all these symbols, right? These monuments, and what kind of reaction that's producing. I mean, I don't appreciate the violence, but I also feel like, yeah, it's the ultimate expression of the kinds of exposures and conversations we have to have. And then what follows, I mean, I love what Mora shared, what you've written about Salcedo, you know, those, but they're not the same as what we put up on a, you know, up on a pedestal, you know, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Let me just read another question from Mary Gaudier, which I think is one we haven't directly addressed. And so she asks, how would we as scholars create the criteria or vetting process as to who we would allow to create new monuments meant for the public eye? Scholars usually, Mary, as you must know, are not necessarily policy makers. And so this is a sort of as if exercise, a kind of speculative moment that you allow us to engage in. And I wonder what the panelists think about this. You know, what would be the criteria? How would we go about deciding if a monument should be erected? And it's kind of strange language to use, but please put your, or take the floor if you wish to address this question. Laura, are you ready? Yes.
Yeah, I've got something to say. Sorry. I had something to add to what Catherine just said, and to echo, I agree with her. And just to take it from a different point of view, we're talking very much about monuments in the global north in a way, even though this is a discussion about Latin America. And you know, there are long histories in the region that I study, which is the Maya region in Mesoamerica, of ritual termination of monuments. So it's an active sort of ancestral tradition to eliminate monuments that are then that is actually part of a new cycle of recreation and of transmitting historical memory and of asserting identity and, you know, and pride. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add. And in terms of the vetting process of who we would allow to create monuments, which is the question that you just asked, and I've just diverged and gone back again, I would only say that, yeah, this is my yeah, I think it's a question of case by case and location by location, because it wouldn't be up to academics, I don't think, to decide what, or necessarily policymakers, unless it were on a local level.
So you mentioned local and collective coming out of your area of study. I think those are two important concepts. Any others that we would all collectively wish to add on to, given the opportunity to pretend we are policymakers?
I don't want to volunteer anybody, but I think it would be interesting to hear from Antonio Maturel, who went through a vetting process in terms of the Puerto Rican monument.
Thanks, June. Antonio. Well, if we don't have Antonio online,
I finally found it.
Tell us. You talk a bit in your article, but we could be even more pragmatic.
Well, actually, I can speak about my own experience. Segundo Cardona, the architect, and I were selected by a committee in New York. Very varied composition, but essentially brought forth by the Puerto Rican community in New York. They actually vouched for it and got the monies together, got the state involved, and they selected a proposal for over 100 other proposals. And we were very lucky, and I am very pleased that when I did go there for the official inauguration, it was so well received. It was received with joy, although it is a cry into the world, it's a lament, but deliberately, Segundo and I based the whole glass labyrinth in tropical hues, and it countered the laments. We made it very hopeful, very cheerful, because we wanted to echo the plight and flight of the Puerto Rican people. It's like a snail's path, and it echoes the snail carrying the house with him. So it was, children ran around it. People now sit on it to read or to do meditation. It overlooks the river, and it gives me pleasure to know that such a deadly affair gave the opportunity for visitors of all kinds to enjoy a place and see through it. It works as a transparency, also like a mirror. And they read these gorgeous verses from Julio de Burgos, this very dramatic, plaintive, very forceful verses, this cry for freedom and justice, and in a wonderful, joyful way. And people appreciated, and I was very touched by the fact that they did.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Antonio. I would say very briefly to add to Mary's question that the very study of the groups that come together to fund a memorial is itself very productive research. That it's an instance in which civil society comes together, or of course it's the state that dictates official commemorations. I will close with one final question that I see here for Andreas Huyssen, and it's from Leila Moreno, asking about more deictic monuments, such as commemorative plaques that combine document and monument, and what your thoughts might be about that. And this question is directed to Andreas. Thank you.
I think plaques and the idea of memorial plaques are, I think, important. And I have one example that is quite telling, which has been very useful. And it's in my experiences in the Northern Hemisphere. So it is from there, but it is these, what the Germans call Stolpersteine, these brass inlets into the pavement in front of houses from which Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other death camps. And these plaques inserted in the sidewalk in front of houses have become enormously widespread all over Europe, but they have also generated kind of attacks by neo-Nazis who try to destroy them or pour black color on them and things of that sort. So you see that even plaques, something as small, minimalist as a memorial object, can cause this kind of opposition of destruction. But I think basically, to the extent that they mainly serve, of course, documentation, they're very much important, in the context of memory culture at large. I mean, this is more or less what I have to say to that question.
Thank you. June, I think we're out of time. There's one other question from Mom, but you
I think we are out of time. So if you would like to give some final words.
I will say thank you to you, June, and your wonderful team. And thank you to all the remarkable scholars. I have found this ReVista, really energizing and full of truly important insights. So thank you for your time here and for the discussion and for the pleasure of exchanging ideas, which is what we're here to do.
Thank you. And thank you to all you wonderful, wonderful authors without whom this launching and this ReVista would not have been possible. And to the wonderful audience, thank you also. Take care.